First, I want to thank everyone for coming out. I want to thank everyone immensely for participating in your government. I'm here to do your work, just as the other 6 of us are on council. I just wanted to mention that what the referendum does is it is the residents of the city giving council the authority to go into debt. Once the referendum should pass, that doesn't immediately say that we are in debt at that point, that our city manager is going to sign the paperwork and the next day it's done. It gives us the authority to do it, and means that, quite frankly, if council felt differently than the voters, council could turn it down in the end game anyway. However, if it fails, that ends the conversation at that point. So I just wanted to explain to everyone that it's a little bit of an arduous process. The last 26 years, I think we've had, this is the 3rd referendum, one in 92, I think it was, to buy parkland, which passed, one in 2000 to purchase the property for the reservoir and build the reservoir, and now it's the logical extension of our water system and stormwater management that we go forward in with the referendum. We have several people from the city here. They're going to each take a segment that is their area of expertise, and at that point there'll of course be time for questions and answers and all. The lead-off person is our city manager, Tom Coleman. He'll be followed by our public works director, Tim Pulaski, and followed then by our finance director, Dave Del Grande, and we have our Parks and Recs director here, Joe Spadafino, and they're with Mark and Megan, who work for Tom in the city manager's office doing communication, and the assistants to the assistant.
Assistant to the manager.
Assistant to the manager, there you go. Mark Brainerd does a wonderful job there, and as a lot of you know, we're looking for a new city manager. That process is going forward. That will be Tom's greatest day, that he gets to go back to what he really loves doing, is taking care of all your water infrastructure and streets and roads and all. So I'll turn it over to Tom, and again, I want to thank everyone for coming out tonight, for participating tonight, and as I said, there'll be time for questions and so forth, and we'll be here to answer any other questions you may have. But thank you for coming out, and Tom.
All right, thank you, Jerry. I'll second what Jerry's commentary. Thanks for everyone coming out tonight. You didn't have to be here, so I'm glad you came. This is the 6th of 9 planned town halls where we're going to discuss the referendum process and the projects that are included in the referendum. If you're looking for something to do tomorrow night, we'll be at council chamber doing the same thing. And Thursday night, we'll also be at council chamber doing the same thing. So we could give you a full week if you really want to get involved. But I'm not sure how many of you had a chance to take a look at the boards. Most of the projects that are proposed for, that are included in the referendum rather, are on the boards. As Jerry said, my name's Tom Coleman. I'm the acting city manager. I have been since, I guess, a little over a year now. Tonight, we're going to be going over some of the more frequently asked questions that we've gotten about the referendum process and the city's infrastructure. We'll then provide an overview of the projects that are included in the referendum. After that, we'll move into a financial discussion of why we feel that debt makes sense. We'll review the available funding sources to the city and our current and proposed debt obligations. Then we'll finish up with Q&A at the end. As Jerry said, these are the 4 people that will be talking tonight: myself, Dave Del Grande, our finance director, Tim Pulaski, acting public works director, and Joe Spadafino, our parks and recreation director. So I figured I'd start with the most basic question, and that's why are we proposing a referendum in the first place? Well, the short version is that we have a lot of large infrastructure projects that need to happen, and we don't have the cash to pay for them. Because of that, we'll need to borrow money to complete the projects. The city's charter outlines our power to actually borrow and incur debt, and it specifically requires, outside of a very narrow types of projects, that we have a referendum to authorize that borrowing. Now, as Jerry pointed out, it's important to note that it only authorizes the city to borrow. It doesn't actually authorize the borrowing. So all of these projects will come to council on their own, will have to stand on their own. So right now we have cost estimates that we've developed. The projects will have to be finished up, engineered, put out to bid. Those bids will come back to council. If the price is way out of line with our initial expectations, or if the project scope changes, there's plenty of time to voice concerns. As you'll see as I move through the process, a few of the questions have multiple projects in each question. If you have a concern with one individual project in the question, doesn't mean you have to throw the baby out with the bathwater. You can still vote for it and then express your concern about a specific project with your council person, and they can choose at a future date to say, you know what, I realize this question passed, but I've been getting lots of feedback that there was concerns with one specific project, and they can strike that project, as Jerry pointed out. So historically, we've used it a handful of times, debt that is, most recently for the reservoir and the South Wellfield water treatment plant in the early 2000s. Otherwise, we pay for almost all of our infrastructure and capital projects using cash. So what are the questions that you'll be voting on? Compared to the last referendum, the questions are handled differently. So last referendum, there was one question for the reservoir, and there was one question for the South Wellfield iron and manganese removal plant. Here we're going to be, okay. Sorry about that. I'll slow down. So the previous referendum was two questions. Question not specific to order. One question was the referendum construction, purchase and construction of the reservoir. The second question was the construction of an iron and manganese removal plant at on our South Wellfield. So we had wells that had too much iron. It caused issues with taste and odor and staining of clothes and things like that. So it was a plan to remove that and improve the water quality.
Has that been solved?
Yes. So that plant was built in 2002 and has been working very well since that time.
Question, how much debt remains from the reservoir and that water treatment?
So we'll get into all that if we could hold questions to the end, because we got a lot of slides to get through, but yeah, we'll cover all those in depth for sure. So on this referendum, questions 1 and 2 are both related to the Rodney project. Question 1 covers the purchase of the land, the demolition of the existing structures, environmental remediation of the site, construction of the pond itself, and construction of a multi-use path connecting Dallam Road and the underpass there on South Main Street. Question 2 includes the additional park amenities like walking paths, pavilions, a fishing pier, educational components like an outdoor classroom, and educational playground equipment. Both questions 1 and 2 will be financed through the state revolving loan program at the state at an interest rate that's been locked in at 2% should we move forward. Question 3 includes all of our proposed water and sewer utility projects. Those are the ones over here on the boards. If you had a chance to look at them earlier, we'll go into detail of the projects later. Those would also be funded through the state's revolving loan program, but we don't have an interest rate yet on those. We haven't locked them in. I've checked recently on what the rates are. They vary, and they're in the 2 to 3% range, so they're still quite low. Question 4 covers all of our general fund and parking fund projects. So general funds are like streets, parking lots, that sort of thing. Those would be financed through a bank loan or general obligation bonds. Our finance director, Dave, will go into much more detail on the financing later tonight. So when you go to vote, each of the questions will have 2 choices. One is for bond certificate of indebtedness issue, and the other is against. If you vote for, that means you are in support of authorizing the borrowing. If you vote against, it means you do not want to authorize the borrowing. And then, actually, when you step into the booth, you're going to be looking at a ballot like this. So each question is here, and then you're either for or against each one. So for on the top, against on the bottom. Just so you know what you're looking at when you get there. So.
It's possible it's possible for number 1 to pass, but 3 to fail? That happens?
Yes, so each question stands on its own except question, well, not even really question 2. So the park can pass, the park amenities can fail, and the project will still go forward. Question 3 could go on its own and pass or fail on its own, and question 4 can go and pass or fail on its own. Each project stands on its own. But question 2 does build off question 1. That's the only difference. So tonight you're going to hear Dave and I refer to the term capital in reference to spending and budgeting, so I wanted to provide a definition. So our charter defines capital as any project or equipment, including any extension or addition thereto or thereof, having a life expectancy in excess of, or to be financed over a period of greater than 6 years, or have a value exceeding $20,000. So that's a mouthful. I will not be quizzing on that later. But, all right, so what are some examples of capital? For us, capital projects are usually things like what we have listed here, and that's infrastructure. The large majority of our capital spending is going to be on an item like this, mainly because they're very expensive, and like your house or car, they need to be maintained or replaced periodically. So how much infrastructure do we have? A lot. I'm going to walk through each of our utilities and give you a quick overview so you have an idea of the scale. So we have the most water infrastructure by a large margin, and most of these items are quite expensive. For example, it costs us around $1.2 million to replace 1 mile of small diameter water main, like what's in front of your house. As you can see there, we have 140 miles of water mains just in the finished water system. In total, we estimate the replacement value of our water infrastructure is around $200 million if we had to replace it all today. That's almost $6,000 worth of water infrastructure for every resident of Newark. That's just for water. We also have a lot of sewer infrastructure. The total replacement value for sewer is less than water because it's more easily rehabilitated, often without digging up the street. But even with that, it's still more than $67 million. Stormwater is even more than sanitary sewer at around $100 million. Stormwater is unique in that we have different pipe materials, and each one has a dramatically different lifespan. So because of that, we're really only concerned about one kind at this point, and that's corrugated metal pipe. We call it CMP. CMP lasts around 35 to 40 years, and we have about 5 miles of that. That's the pipe that we're most concerned about today because almost all of it is either at or beyond its expected life. The rest of our pipe is either reinforced concrete or high-density polyethylene, that black corrugated pipe, and that lasts around 100 years on average. In addition to our pipes, we have 65 city-maintained stormwater ponds and facilities, mostly in residential neighborhoods. Our electric infrastructure is made up of substations, lines, transformers, and our McKee's solar facility off Cleveland Avenue. We estimate the replacement value of the electric utilities infrastructure to be $50 million or more. In addition to our traditional utilities, we also have parking infrastructure consisting of our downtown parking lots and meters. Our parking fund's treated the same as our traditional enterprise utilities like water and sewer and electric, and that we keep the revenues separate. So when you pay your water bill, your sewer bill, or your electric bill, it goes into a different account. And then at the end of the year, we take a profit margin off of that, basically like 20% off the top comes over to the general fund, which is the city's profit margin on that company, basically. So the parking is the same way. Lastly, we have our general fund infrastructure, which includes city-maintained streets, city hall, the police station, our parks, and other city-maintained facilities. This is the infrastructure that's supported by taxes and that transfer, that profit margin off the enterprise utilities. In total, we estimate the current replacement value of our infrastructure and capital assets at around $500 million. That's a huge number considering we're a city of just over 33,000 people. That means we have over $15,000 worth of infrastructure for every resident in the city. The vast majority of it is underground or at least out of sight and out of mind, so it's easy to forget about until you hit a pothole with your car, like what's being fixed on Main Street right now. Your toilet won't flush or the lights go out. Now, while it's helpful to know how much of everything we have, it's a lot better to know what condition it's in so we can plan. So what's the condition of our infrastructure? I'm going to go through those same utilities in the same order. And you'll see we've got different levels of information for each one. Starting with water, I'm going to focus on the water mains first because they make up the majority of the value of the assets. Now with water, getting good condition assessment is difficult because the water mains are under pressure, the whole system is under pressure, and it has to remain in service during the investigation. We've begun piloting some different technologies that will indirectly measure the remaining service life, but we haven't rolled out widespread implementation on it. It's relatively new technology. In the meantime, we use a combination of our main break history, water quality complaints, like when you turn the water on, it comes out red and stains your clothes, pipe age, pipe material, and industry guidelines to estimate the remaining service life and prioritize our replacement efforts. As I'll show in the next few slides, a lot of our water mains are going to hit or exceed their expected life and expire in the near future. It's important to point out that expiring doesn't mean the pipe will stop working, but I'll get into that a little more soon. So this is what we like to refer to as the bathtub diagram, and it shows the general failure pattern for pipes. You often get a quick round of failures as manufacturing defects break early, and then after that first burn-in phase, you'll enter the constant failure rate phase where failure rate's really low for a long time, so it's a 100-year pipe. So for probably 90 years, you're in that constant failure rate phase and you're getting very few breaks, maybe one every decade or so. And then at the end of the pipe's life, you hit the wear out phase and the failure rate goes up exponentially with time. So the expected life varies depending on the material and manufacturing methodology. And generally, the older the main, listen to this one carefully, the older the main, the longer the life, because they didn't have the same manufacturing methods and technology. So instead of being able to make a very narrow tolerance pipe, they just made them really thick. We can't be accurate narrow, we'll just make it an inch thick. We've got an example of our water main off Main Street over there, and you'll see it's about an inch thick. And then if you look at one of our other examples, which is a much newer pipe, it's much thinner. So our oldest mains, like what's in Main Street, put in the 1800s, has an expected life of 100 to 120 years. The mains that were installed in the middle of the 20th century, like 1930 through very recent, have a lifespan as low as 55 years. And then the water mains we put in since 2016, when we changed our installation methods and technologies, are back up to 100 years or more. So this slide gets into what I mentioned earlier about how a pipe expires. So the green line, which is this one, is the cost to operate the pipe. So this is age, so the further this way, the older the pipe gets, further this way, the more it costs. So you'll see at a certain point, this blue line is the cost to replace and operate. So at a certain point, the cost to operate the existing pipe exceeds the cost to replace it. And the reason that happens is because of main breaks and interruptions in service and emergency repairs. Each water main break is accompanied by a service outage. So people are without water, businesses are without water. Oftentimes we're making large road repairs as a result of it. So like I said, at a certain point, it becomes more expensive to operate the existing one than replace it. When that point is depends on the pipe material, how it was installed, the soil conditions. So a lot of what drives pipe length is also the soil that's sitting in. Is it a very corrosive soil or is it not? Right now we're working to develop an accurate estimate for all of our 140 miles of pipe, but that's going to take some time. For the sake of this presentation, we're going to show you information using the recommendations from the American Water Works Association, or AWWA, that's the Association for Water Companies, which is to assume a 70-year life on average for water mains. We feel based on the areas of the city where we're seeing advanced failure rates, this is generally going to be accurate for Newark, or at least accurate enough to get an idea of our average condition. So this is a map of our water system. So these are the water mains in our distribution system, so after the treatment plant. You'll see they're color-coded based on what we've estimated to be their remaining service life using that 70-year value. So you'll notice downtown, a lot of this area is red. That means it's in excess of 70 years old already. There's a large area here that's orange, which means it will hit that 70-year life in the next 5 years. There's a little bit of yellow in here along Elkton Road that all went in around the same time. That's the next 5 to 10 years. And you'll see this kind of light blue color that's all over the place. That's 15 years out. So the next slide, I think, will be a little easier to understand. So this is that same information shown as bars. So we have about 15 miles currently that exceeds its expected life, and then another 12 miles that are 0 to 5 years, 9 miles that are 5 to 10, and then 38 that are in the next 15 years. So 15 years from now, the total mileage of pipe, can you turn the lights back on? That's going to be expired will be 74, absent continued or increased effort to replace mains. That's over half of our system. It'll be 59 miles, even if we hit our current target of replacing 1 mile every year. That's 42% of the system. And this doesn't count our raw water pipes that carry untreated water from our wells or intakes to the treatment plants. They're all in a similar condition. So after our first presentation, but before now, a new study came out of Utah State University, and the nationwide average is 16% expired. So that we're at 12, we're doing a little better than nationwide average, so that's good. But that's going to change pretty considerably in the next few years. Nationally, the percentage of expired pipes has doubled since 2012, from 8 to 16%, and the break rate of cast iron pipe, which makes up a large portion of our infrastructure, has increased 46% over that same period. So if you remember the bathtub diagram, that curve that's curving up, breaking more often, that's what we're running into. And what you're seeing here, these clumps, so these are building booms, basically. So this is, post-World War II building booms. So the 1950s, when a lot of our residential neighborhoods were built, kind of seeing the first echo of that construction coming back through and having to replace it. So what does this mean for Newark? Well, we should plan for more water main breaks and interruptions in service. So here we've charted the number of main breaks every year going back to 1977, the first year that we have records. Now there's a definite trend, which is probably going to accelerate as a higher percentage of our mains move into the expired category. Each one of these breaks is accompanied by a service outage and occasionally by a boil water order, which can last for 24 to 48 hours. It's actually apropos. We have an outage scheduled for this evening on Main Street because of a broken valve that's going to result in a boil water order on Main Street. So these have real effects and impact our residents on a day-to-day basis. Like I said, the pipes don't stop working, they just stop working well. So moving on from water mains. Starting around 2011, the city began increasing our water and sewer rates from the kind of artificially low rate that was in place prior, which allowed for a capital project initiative where we really started ramping up our capital maintenance efforts. Now, while water mains make up the majority of our water infrastructure, our other water facilities have a much shorter life, so they have to be replaced or rehabilitated more often. And because of that, they punch above their weight from a budget perspective. Now, we've been very busy over the last 7 years, and we've completed over $17 million in water capital fund projects in that time. We also have 2 water treatment plant projects that are currently underway, or we expect to be completed in the next 12 months. The first one, I think, is actually complete now since we started this, and that's at our South Wellfield water treatment plant, which was to improve some of our chemical feed systems. And the second project, which should be started by the end of the summer, is at our main surface water plant to convert from chlorine gas to a liquid bleach system that's much safer and less maintenance intensive.
Where will that be?
Excuse me?
Where is that?
That's at our surface water treatment plant, all along the White Clay Creek. So near Curtis Park, if you know where that is, Paper Mill Road. On the sewer side, we've been working to inspect and develop a prioritization for all our rehab work. So far, we've inspected around 15% of the system, and we've identified $4 million of high priority repairs. We began making many of the repairs during 2017 and have a project underway right now working on those repairs. Since 2011, we've spent nearly $4 million on sewer capital projects and have rebuilt all of our pump stations to modern standards. So the way sewer works is it flows downhill under gravity until it gets too deep, then there's a pump that picks it up and pumps it somewhere higher, and then it continues to flow downhill under gravity. So we have 3 pump stations. They've all been rebuilt since 2011. On the stormwater side, we've been focused on corrugated metal pipe, like I mentioned earlier, because it has such a short service life, and it's been failing all over the city. Starting in 2016, we completed a citywide condition assessment of all our known corrugated metal pipe, and we prioritized the repairs. In total, we identified $3.4 million of repairs that needed to be completed over the next 10 years. As many of you are likely aware, Council authorized the creation of a stormwater utility last year, which became effective on January 1st of this year. Because of that, we have a stable funding source that's been designed to provide an adequate amount of money to meet our operating expenses and complete the repairs that were identified here over the next 5 years at least. The current rate will not cover the cost of the Rodney project, however, which will result in an increase of the median stormwater bill by a little over $1 a month for your average residential customer. Now, for those of you who might drive up and down Wyoming Road, you notice there's some barrels on the left side driving into town where the sidewalk's closed. That's actually one of these failed corrugated metal pipes. That project construction cost is about $90,000 to get from that catch basin just to the stream that's about 100 feet away. If we had been able to make that repair before the pipe failed, it probably would have been closer to $20,000 or $30,000. So getting to these things before they fail is really critical if we're going to be cost effective. All right, so for our road network, we have a full pavement management program where we complete an annual inspection of all the roads, rate them, and then run those ratings through an optimization program to try and develop an optimal project. If we're to keep our city maintained roadways at their current citywide average, that does not count Delaware roadways, so don't count Main Street into that, we need to spend around $1.75 million a year. That's every single year. We've only been able to achieve that number one time since 2011, and we did come fairly close this past year. So it's not a number we've been hitting. In addition to that, we have around $1.5 million in parks capital projects scheduled over the next 5 years that are repair and replacement, not new stuff. So how did we get ourselves into this position? Well, using only cash limits our ability to tackle large projects because they crowd out smaller projects, less sexy replacement projects, and preventative maintenance. It's a lot more exciting to have a new ribbon cutting than it is to replace a pipe that's underground and has worked your whole life without an issue. Our water and sewer rates are also entirely consumption-based and fluctuate considerably with the weather, which results in an unpredictable revenue stream. Over the last 3 years, our water and sewer revenue have underproduced compared to our budget by $3 million because it's been wet and we haven't had water sales. So this year we actually reduced our budgeted estimates for water and sewer revenue pretty considerably, and we're still under them on the water side. We're down 9% year over year because it's rained basically all spring. So that's $3 million that could have gone towards infrastructure maintenance, but didn't, because basically the way our bills are set up, if you use zero water, you get a bill for $0. Now it cost us 50 cents to mail you that bill, and we still had to have the pipe in the road, and we had to have all the employees here working to keep the system running. So that's something that we're going to be working with council to try to address, is to try and add a customer charge so there is no zero charge, and then lower the consumption rate to try and level out the fluctuations that we see in our water revenue. In addition to that, nearly 50% of Newark's land area is tax exempt. I don't think that's going to come as a surprise to anyone in the room. That puts us in a pretty deep hole when it comes to paying for our general fund services like police, and we fill that hole by transferring 20% or more out of our utility revenue every year from everything except the stormwater fund. I think we got it right with the stormwater utility, and we lockboxed that funding, so no money can be transferred out of the stormwater fund into the general fund to cover balances like that. That's all money that could have been used for infrastructure maintenance. Now, all those things said, the biggest issue that we're facing is that we're entering the first round of the replacement era. So historically, we've not had to pay for most of the infrastructure that we have because it was paid for by developers or the federal government through grants. Now we're finally approaching the first replacement cycle for most of these assets, which should really be thought of as liabilities because we don't have the option to not replace them. Even the mains that were installed directly by the city or for the city by contractor were assessed against the adjacent property owners. So you can read our code. If we put a water main across a bunch of properties, we divided the total cost by the linear feet, how many feet of frontage is there, and then came up with a cost per foot and billed every single property directly for those installations. Because of that, our our rate and tax structure has never had to pay for this stuff before. It's not had to absorb that expense. And our revenue demands are going to increase significantly over the next 20 years as things start to wear out, and we actually have to pay for them ourselves. In addition to this, a large majority of Newark's been developed in an unsustainable development pattern. That's suburban-style single-family homes. If you live in a single-family detached home, I can almost guarantee that you're not paying enough to cover the infrastructure necessary to support your house based on our current utility rate and tax levels, somewhat like I discussed earlier. For example, if you live in a house with a 100-foot wide lot, your taxes need to support, in addition to police and general fund expenses, trash collection, the paving and maintenance of at least 50 feet of that road frontage, because it's just you and your neighbor across the street. The same goes for water, sewer, and electric infrastructure. Using our current cost for water main replacement, 50 feet of water main costs about $11,000 to replace. Assuming 10% of your water bill goes towards infrastructure, it'll take over 300 years to pay for just that one piece of main. That's the problem if you remember the average pipe only lasts 70 to 100. It doesn't count anything else like the booster stations, water treatment plants, and things like that. Fortunately, we have locations like our downtown and our industrial users that are able to offset a lot of the shortcomings of our neighborhoods. Where it might take a house 300 years to pay off their section of a main, a building like 58 East Main Street, the one with Qdoba and Honeygrow, it'll pay its off every 2 to 3 years. We see a very similar pattern for our tax base. So this is a map that is still in development that shows whether or not a property is paying enough in taxes to pay for the general fund services it gets. While it's not yet complete, the general idea and scope is not going to change considerably once it is. Based on our preliminary estimates, all the parcels in red do not provide enough tax revenue to cover the cost of providing them with general fund services. Some may come closer than others, but they still don't cover the cost. Parcels that have a positive value are shown in yellow, blue, and green, and those are the ones that make up the difference and balance the budget. What you'll see in general is single-family detached housing is negative, and, sorry, lost my track. And mixed-use downtown, higher density development is positive. It means if we're to approve a new single-family neighborhood today, it will make us poorer as a community than doing nothing, because we'll be taking on more liabilities than revenues. Now, higher density development like townhomes and downtown mixed-use condominiums, they, on the other hand, do pay enough and will help us reduce the need for future tax increases because they pay more than their fair share. Now, for those of you that may live in Fountain View or in a condominium or a townhouse, I don't want you to disown your friends that have single-family homes or think that we're going to go in and raise their neighborhoods and build skyscrapers. That's not going to happen. I just wanted to start the conversation and identify the problem, so at least we know that this is an issue. We know that that's what we should try to avoid moving forward, and we can make different decisions, or at least decisions with our eyes open.
Could you point out District 2 on that?
So District 2 is generally over here, so this side. So Fountain View is a condominium, so it's actually not color-coded. Like I said, it's not finished yet, but you'll see there's actually some yellow and reds, some reds, but a lot of yellows in here because they're mostly townhomes. Some of the more interesting things, the quality's not that great. One of the more interesting takeaways from this is, townhomes, even areas that you wouldn't think, like Madison Drive, almost all of those are better off than Christiansted, the Hunt of Levere's, these neighborhoods with huge houses and large tax bills. Their lots are so much bigger that it ends up negating the benefit. So I know this presentation's been a lot of doom and gloom, but it's not all bad news, and it's definitely isn't unique to Newark. Cities all across the nation are looking at the same problem, whether they know it yet or not. Illinois, for example, just determined they need to spend $21 billion, that's B billion, each year on infrastructure, when historically they've spent closer to $3 billion. When you consider their entire state budget is only $38 billion, an extra $18 billion in infrastructure spending, it's going to be a heavy lift for them. Fortunately for us, I think we're in a much better place than a lot of other cities. Firstly, since around 2011, our city council's shown a real desire to start tackling the problem, which is reinforced by the fact that we're talking about taking on debt to get in front of it today. We're also a relatively compact city compared to our peers. Dover, for example, has 2.5 times our land area, yet only 10% more people. So you can see they've got a lot more to support per person than we do. We're also in the fortunate position of having the Star Campus, which will be bringing all new revenue to the city soon. So every private project that's completed at Star will bring us new tax revenue, and every project period that's completed at Star will bring us new utility revenue, electric utility revenue in particular, that we've never had. We never served Chrysler, so Delmarva Power served them. So that's new revenue that we'll be selling that will help offset costs that we currently have and help keep our electric rates low or even drive the rates lower than they are today. At build-out, Star Campus is expected to have a demand greater about 60% of the entire city of Newark today, just at Star Campus. So it's a lot of demand, and we'll also be selling them sewer, water to certain portions of the site, so that will be good for us the sooner they get that going. The university is also planning to add 4,000 grad students. I'm not sure if, make sure everybody's seated, 4,000 grad students in the next 5 years and up to 1,500 undergraduates over the next 10 years. Graduate students are year-round young professional residents who live and work in Newark. And if we can provide them downtown housing at a density that's productive, like I mentioned earlier, we can get all the benefits, the additional utility sales tax revenue, without a lot of the problems like traffic and public school impacts that generally accompany new development. As I'm sure most of you are aware, there's also a pretty high demand in Newark for 55 and over communities. If we can incent people to build that type of housing downtown, that will be a good thing for Newark. So every 1% that we add to the tax base is 1 more percent of revenue that can go towards our infrastructure that doesn't have to come from our existing residents. So I'm going to hand it over to Tim, who's going to go over all the various projects that are included in the referendum. But before he begins, I want to point out that all the projects that we're going to discuss were in the approved 5-year capital budget, which can be found at these links. These links will be on the city's website at newarkde.gov/vote. And at this time, I'll hand it over to Tim.
Thank you, Tom. And this always makes me feel like I have to look over top of it, so I apologize. Dave's got an inch or two on me, so you'll see his whole head. So again, thank you, Tom, for giving the overview. Excuse me. Again, I'm Tim Fulaski, Acting Public Works Director. Tom is usually the Public Works Director, and he hopes to really get back there at some point. And we miss him. We joke that he doesn't even get our inside jokes anymore. So he's got a lot to learn when he comes back, but we look forward to having him back. I'm going to give you a high-level view on some of these projects, but we're certainly here afterward. And at any time, at City Hall, we're certainly, Jerry knows where we are in City Hall, and he can certainly get any questions to us that you may have about any of these projects, or really any project. And there's also, we'll be here afterward. You can ask any questions you may need. But many of the projects that we're going to bring up here are ongoing projects or programs which you may have heard Tom or I discuss or bring contracts to council in previous years. Others are overdue rehabilitation or upgrades to facilities that provide our water and other services throughout the city. Again, please feel free to reach out to us. We've set up an email specifically for the referendum, but we're planning to keep it on after the referendum, and it's fairly simple. It's Ask Newark. Ask any question. So Ask Newark at newark.de.us, and it'll come up on a slide for, I believe, Tom's final slide will have that information on it. So the first projects here we're looking at, there was some question over here on the board. It's listed as one project, but council has actually voted to break the Rodney Stormwater project up into 2 parts. And those parts are essentially to purchase the property. And then, hopefully many of you have actually seen or heard our proposal for purchasing the Rodney dorms and demolishing to make way for a stormwater management pond with park amenities. We believe this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for the city to acquire a piece of land well situated to help achieve stormwater quality and quantity improvements. The parcel sits at the top of a large drainage area where there is little to no stormwater controls currently. managing stormwater near its source is a key benefit to downstream systems. The closer that we can, if we can take some runoff out of the equation, it opens up capacity in pipes downstream and allows some of that drainage to get off the roads and into the pipes and not so close to folks' houses and cars. The parcel is also situated in an area that lacks city-owned open space in close proximity to our award-winning Main Street. When we got started on this project and started looking at where it was, one of our consultants brought it to our attention by putting it on a map that had dots on all of our city-owned parks, and they all surrounded Main Street, but there was nothing right on Main Street. Now, if you happen to own land on Main Street, you're probably not going to put a park on it. However, this land is well situated for that, and a very close proximity within, I think I have it up here on the slide, that approximately 6,000 residents live within a 15-minute walk of this property, and nearly 2/3 of our residents live within a 10-minute bike ride of the site. And those are important demographics for the Parks Department. They bring those up for grant opportunities and in winning awards and things that we get for our parks. So what we can do, what we're able to do is we're able to combine the pond and the park to address all the important issues that we previously stated, as well as serve as a showcase for educational efforts to show residents and visitors how they can contribute to keeping our stormwater and ultimately our drinking water clean. So just so you're aware, most of the runoff that runs off Newark goes into either Christina Creek or the White Clay Creek. Eventually, about 400,000 people drink from the water that comes out of those two creeks at some point down the line. So it's important to keep our water clean for not only the city of Newark, but for our neighbors in Newcastle County. It's also important to note that the concept plan for the pond and the park features that we've presented here is the product of an extensive public process that included input and suggestions from many residents in a year-long effort in 2017. We actually used a consultant in conjunction with our communications team to get feedback from what the residents wanted to see and be able to focus that into a concept that we came up with. So again, the first part, although the project vision was to develop the pond and the park together as complementary to one another, we are able to break out the stormwater management needs from the aesthetically pleasing park amenities into two questions. A yes vote on Rodney question 1 will authorize council to borrow money from the state revolving loan fund, as Dave will discuss more later, for the purchase of the property, the demolition, the environmental remediation, the pond construction, and some minor amenities to allow site accessibility and maintain the current pathway from Dallam Road, which this is Hillside Road and Dallam Road, so it's a major bike connector and pedestrian connector over to the underpass there on South Main Street. Minor landscaping and pond edge treatments would also be included, mostly for safety and for mosquito and safety issues for pond edges. The estimated cost associated with this question is $6.5 million. So a yes vote on Rodney question 2 would authorize council to borrow money from the state revolving loan fund to fund the majority of the park amenities that were discussed and chosen as part of the public workshops in 2017. The residents who participated in the discussion agreed that the passive recreation coupled with a small classroom space and an outdoor picnic area was the best fit for the space. An accessible fishing pier was also included, but the pond, we don't anticipate the pond being stocked. If it becomes very popular and they need it to be stocked, then we'll certainly look into that. I think Joe has a stocked backyard that he can supply some fish for us. So extensive educational signage and elements will be integrated into the site to show residents and visitors the role stormwater management plays in our ecosystem and in our city. So as Dave Del Grande will discuss, the funding for the park amenities through the revolving loan funds are locked at 2%, and the approval is awaiting our signature. Funding these upgrades in future years with other sources of funding will certainly cost more. So just if you are familiar with the site, this parking exists and the parking along Forest Lane exists. So there's a grove of trees here in the northeast corner that would remain. And then everything else, as you see, there would be a trail circling and then some pavilions and park amenities there. This is South Main Street, right here. This is Forest Lane. It's just a small lane, takes you back to the old Newark Post building.
Can you talk for a minute about the topography? And, I mean, I'm not clear if the water source, I know it's a very wetland area, is it coming up from underground, or is it going to be coming in from rain? Or?
A little of both. So we can, it's going to remain wet at all times, so it's a wet pond. And mostly because we probably have to line that in order to keep it wet. So once you design a wet pond, you don't want it to go dry. So once it's wet, it would actually have a circulating pump of some sort to keep the water moving, but it would also likely be lined. There is a slight, so the pipe that runs through the property currently has a slight base flow. So there is always water, groundwater, those type of things running into the pipes that run through. So that would be redirected into the pond basically to keep the pond refreshed. But every time it rains, the pond would fill up and then slowly release back down. So in general, most of the water in the pond would come from the upstream drainage area being the Oaklands and part of Nottingham Manor.
Tim, do you have any input as far as the technology that's available to make sure that this is clean, okay, it will stay clean? How do you handle it if there's a problem?
And by
The water is, it's not acceptable for consumption.
well, we're not, I mean, we don't use this for drinking directly, and obviously it would be, and the drinking water folks, the folks that take it out for drinking water downstream would certainly have, they test the water coming into the plant. We're going to do monitoring here just for our MPDS permit. We've actually partnered with the Water Resource Agency or Water Resource Center at the University of Delaware, Jerry Kaufman and his group, to do some baseline testing ahead of time, and then obviously to get some testing afterward to see what the effect on water quality actually is.
This is stormwater management, this is not drinking water.
That is correct. It affects drinking water downstream.
You say that the water will accumulate and there'll be a liner and it needs to stay wet. You also have a rain garden in which the water accumulates and drains into the soil. Where's the rain garden? Is that a small pond up there?
So the rain garden actually would be in this region. So there's a small drainage area that comes through, and that will be treated here. It likely won't actually drain into the ground. It might drain through an under drain, but then it would be treated with a rain garden in that vicinity. I'm going to get way off track. If we can answer questions afterward on the Rodney portion itself, I would appreciate it.
Do you have to buy this property? Can that be rented?
At this point, we have to purchase it. We have a purchase agreement. So we've discussed with the university, and I think Tom will tell you that we tried to have them give it to us. We didn't want to buy it, but that wasn't the option. But we did get a very good price on it, judging by what we believe the Dickinson parcel will sell for. We believe that that's somewhere north of $8 million, and in total, when it's all said and done, we're looking at about $1.4 million here for this property. So for comparable properties, you're looking at a significant discount that the university provided. So
What about the geese? Are they going to be crossing the street now?
we will do everything we possibly can to keep the geese out, I promise. So again, if we have more questions on Rodney, I'm certainly open to answer them afterward. I just don't want to get too far off track and lose track on the water and sewer. They're certainly just as important. So the first project that we anticipate starting with the question for water, which would be question 3, would be the Laird Track well field restoration. As Tom mentioned, we have a south well field, which we currently use. We also have what we call the Laird Track well, which is up on, which is roughly the area along the White Clay Creek along North College and Creek Road. And then that system of pipes pumps it back to where our current treatment plant is. So it will effectively double our drought resiliency and bring back some production that was furloughed when the reservoir came online in 2006. These wells are protected in the White Clay Creek State Park or the surrounding area, which is basically all wooded, and will be part of a long-term solution to drawing our water from the most protected areas of the city. So when the creek gets too low, we can't pull water anymore out of the creek. So that's when we go to the reservoir and we start pulling water from the reservoir. If we were to have another source to feed the reservoir other than the creek, we could continually feed the reservoir and take water from the reservoir, thereby increasing the drought resiliency that we have. So the second bullet point here, we do have an acronym. It's called SCADA, but it's actually known as Supervisory Control and Data Acquisition. This is an ongoing project which essentially allows us to be in 2 or more places at one time. We're able to monitor system data. We basically have, we can monitor what's going into the plant, what's coming out of the plant, the chemicals that are being used, and the pumps that are on, and the general welfare of our system as a whole. We have one water treatment plant operator on 24 hours a day, and it's not the same water plant operator. He does go home and take a break. So we have 4 water treatment plant operators on 24 hours a day, and basically we have treatment plants that are several miles away. So if something is going on in a treatment plant, with this system, Tom and I can actually go on from our offices, from our phones, from our homes even, and make minor adjustments and monitor the system without having to physically be there. So as part of that, we have, and as part of the SCADA system, we have the South Wellfield treatment plant upgrades. Tom mentioned this, the South Wellfield was actually on the previous referendum along with the reservoir. What many of you may or may not be aware of, we actually had a meeting right here in this building with the EPA, is that they were nice enough to list us on their national register, which is commonly known as a Superfund. It actually is good news that they listed us on the Superfund list, and that is because we get more money from the federal government to actually trace and treat the source of the contamination. Luckily, we are able to treat the contamination with what's called an air stripper. Unfortunately, our air stripper is nearing the end of its useful life, and it can no longer treat the amount of contaminants that we have in certain wells, and we've had to shut the production off in those wells. So this would be an upgrade to that system, and also to add some capacity so that we can use wells that we currently cannot use. There's also some other modern upgrades that are being vetted for inclusion in this facility. So water main replacement, you heard Tom had quite a few comments on the water main replacement. We are looking at, I think, roughly $100 million before we replace all of our water mains, so we have to start somewhere. We are in need of a system-wide study. However, we do have enough information and data to target and fix the worst of what we know is bad now within this next 5-year CIP, or Capital Improvement Program cycle. We also have 5 water tanks that currently have lead-based coatings. It is important to note that the lead is on the outside, not on the inside, so that's a good thing. But and while the state is beginning to draft legislation on methods to remove this lead paint, we are exploring options to physically remove the tank altogether and build a new tank, and it's almost the cost is comparable to blasting and painting the structure that's there. So if we do go the dry blasting route, though, we will have our specifications drafted to reflect the state regulations, which will be in place before we begin this work. So the sewer, the part that's included in this for our sewer system is actually one project, but we again call this a program. It's inclusive of several steps in the rehabilitation process. The first step is to identify the critical lines and perform inspections using closed circuit television, or CCTV as it's more commonly known. The CCTV inspections are then reviewed and the defects in the pipes prioritized in a report that we use to group the projects that are identified for similar rehabilitation methods. As Tom mentioned earlier, it's easier to rehabilitate a sewer line because you don't have to dig up the road. At the end of every sewer line is a manhole. You can actually access through the manhole, and they put what looks like a sock into the pipe, and then they blow it up with either steam, hot water, or actually UV light to cure the pipe in place. And then essentially you have a brand new pipe inside of the old pipe. What happens with sewer lines, obviously there's nutrient-rich items within the sewer lines, and the roots and things can grow through the cracks, and then they create giant root balls, and so you have to fill in those cracks and get the pipes lined. So, but again, as Tom said, we don't have to repair the road, we don't have to put it back together. We simply line it and call it a day. And again, as Tom noted, we've identified roughly $4 million worth of these repairs after inspecting 15% of the system. Now, we have inspected the 15% of the system that we know is in reasonably bad condition. So I'm not sure it will be linear, but it'll be somewhat close to $3 to $4 million in each 10% of system that we inspect. And it should be noted that we have completed close to $1 million of these repairs in just the past few years. And again, there was some, if you tried to go to McDonald's on Main Street about 2 weeks ago, they had one of the entrances closed because we were lining the line there on McKees Lane. So, and finally, question 4 deals with our general fund questions. And again, our general fund is what is not part of an enterprise fund, but it keeps the city moving. These are these projects are generally included for proposed debt financing, and excuse me, Dave will get into a little bit later on how we plan to fund these. Many of these projects are necessary for the operation of the city, yet they always seem to get a lower priority than the utilities and the other projects. So our ADA transition plan has been in place since about 2008 and utilizes city funds as well as a federal block grant fund in order to upgrade the handicapped accessibility and transportation routes to comply with the current ADA standards. We have replaced nearly 1,400 of the 1,800 existing ramps, as well as upgraded many city-owned facilities during this program. We did some work at City Hall, and basically, if you've ever noticed, these are the little red squares with the domes on them that allow you to get where you're going safely. So we do have a plan in place, and if we do not continue this is a federal program, and we could, we can be fined by the federal government if we don't continue with this project. So the hard surface improvements here, that's actually most of our parking lots, trails, and athletic courts within our award-winning park system. So that's basically upgrading and maintaining some of the infrastructures that are on our well-used park system. We just got numbers today. I believe that the top 3, maybe we're hedging a little more, but the top 3 used trails in the state are actually here within the city of Newark. That's the Hall Trail, the Pomeroy Trail, and now we have recent counts on the Reservoir Trail. And all are within the top 5 and currently the top 3 used trails within the state. It's interesting to note that the Reservoir Trail actually was used 9,000 to 10,000 times per day, even in February. So it's certainly well worth it to keep these park projects up to date and make sure that we get the needed attention that they get. Now, where possible, we do piggyback these projects on our annual street program. As Tom mentioned, we need to be spending $1.75 million. When we spend $1.75 million, we get better pricing than parks alone may be able to get, on a $100,000 or $200,000 project. So we use the economy of scale to help our friends in the Parks Department. So our field operations complex is where we store all of our equipment and material used for maintaining the streets, water lines, parks, sewers, and other infrastructure that we've discussed previously. So we lack storage space to keep this expensive equipment out of the weather, and phase 1 of this project was enabled us to build a new salt shed brought online in 2016. So the new salt shed allowed us to store enough salt to get us through an entire year, and no more fighting with DelDOT and other municipalities at the barge at the Port of Wilmington. We have plenty of salt, and we're all ready to go. All this costs money, and we have to figure out a way how to get that money, and there's no better person than Dave Del Grande. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dave and get a look at why we're looking at using debt service.
Thank you, Tim. Dave Del Grande, the Finance Director, and Thanks for sticking with us. I only have 50 more slides to go. Really, it's 51, sorry. So debt, why debt? Why are we doing this and borrowing the money? So as Tom mentioned, the city has historically used cash to fund the majority of our capital needs. Debt financing accomplishes two main goals, and one is it fairly allocates the cost of a project over its useful life. It allows everyone to pay their fair share of the cost of the project over the period the asset is in use. And the other is long-term debt has a minimal impact on the annual budget, thereby keeping the city's annual revenue requirements as low as possible. Low needs for revenue translates directly into lower utility and tax rates and fees that the city must charge for the services that we provide to you all. So we have three funding options, and there's the state revolving loan, the bond financing, and then lastly a bank loan. Starting with the state revolving loan, it's the most advantageous method to finance all of our water-related projects, and 90% of what we're asking for in this referendum is we're looking to fund through the state revolving loan program. Due to their federal support, the state is able to offer low-interest loans on a competitive basis to all government agencies within the state of Delaware. The low interest and closing costs associated with these loans make them very attractive, especially when the rates in the bond market begin to rise. Annually, the federal government gives about $40 million to the state, which they then allocate into water, sewer, stormwater programs, which then translate into competitive applications from all the agencies for us to compete for that money. And it's thereby keeps the interest rates and the borrowing extremely low. Another advantage to the program is that it provides flexibility with interest-only loans during the construction phase in order to provide budget relief to the agencies benefiting from the program. Our involvement in the state revolving loan program will also make us eligible in the future for grants for our water, sewer, and stormwater projects that we previously did not have access to. So ultimately, there's been discussions on the interest that we'll be paying on this money that we'll be borrowing, which is probably in the $10 million range over the life of the payback period. So the one great part is that money goes right back to the state, which then turn around can come back to us through grants, which I'll get into in a minute. So if all of our water-related programs are not approved for a state revolving loan, our fallback plan would be to go to the bond market or with a bank loan. The bond market route is the most costly, but provides a lower interest rate than a traditional bank loan. Even with higher fees, a bond authorization is generally the least expensive once we factor in the interest rates when compared to a bank loan. Bond funding becomes more attractive when we begin borrowing amounts over $10 million, since the fees associated with the bond funding remain relatively fixed regardless of the amount that is being borrowed. The city currently benefits from a bond rating of AA+ from Fitch Ratings and AA2 from Moody's Investor Services, and we would need to be reaffirmed by the rating agencies if we were to go out to the bond market for new authorization. Lastly, a bank loan is a viable option for the city to consider. Although they carry a higher interest rate than the bonds, they don't have high fees to go along with them. Fees for our proposed bond could be $100,000 less by going with the bank loan. Lower fees when borrowing smaller amounts of money make loans more advantageous to pursue than a full bond offering. If the referendum were to pass, a bank loan would be considered as a funding source. So our current outstanding loan obligations are around $15 million. The question was asked earlier, how much of that is due to the reservoir? We owe about $6.5 million today for the reservoir loan that we have out there. The green bar represents the debt service paid back on the reservoir and the South Wellfield project collectively. 1.3 million of our annual debt service payments through 2022 account for the reservoir. The next largest piece of our annual $2.7 million debt service bill represents the automated meter infrastructure project, or as we all call them here, the smart meters. The blue bar on this chart, which is rolling across the bottom, represents a payment of $1.1 million annually through 2022 when part of the lease is paid in full, and then the remaining balance of $753,000 will continue through the year 2028 when the city would be technically considered debt-free at that piece. Other items that consist of our smaller projects like parking equipment, the fiber project for our city-owned assets, and energy efficiency projects for city buildings make up the tiny little red bar at the bottom going out from 18 to 2027.
So the current outstanding debt date again is 50 million?
15, 1 5.
1 5.
As of December 31, we were at $15 million. Okay. This slide here represents the projects that would be funded through the state revolving loan program if they're all approved. The first one is, I'm not going to go through every single one, but just to give you a timeline of when our cash needs would be, we would need 2.1 million the rest of this year, and then that number ramps up to 9 next year, 5.7 in 20, 2.5 million, then 4.2 for a total of $23.7 million in the total 5-year plan. The state has already approved this Rodney project for $9 million, and ultimately the state went over the authority that we were asking for only to give us a cushion in case it were needed. And the reason why they did so was it was a special interest rate of 2% versus a standard 3% loan that they've been offering for the rest of their programs. And since these are all competitive based, it was a huge win for the city, ultimately because we were competing against other municipalities in the state of Delaware for this $9 million. And the state found it worthy enough to give the money to Newark. And ultimately something that they'd never done in the past is ultimately approve the project before a referendum was even passed by the city of Newark. So we have a tentative agreement from the state for the $9 million, up to $9 million, I should say, if and when we're ready to use that money, which is unheard of from the state.
Is there a deadline by which it has to be used?
Yes.
When it expires?
We have to have shovels in the ground by end of this year, Tom? So we have to have the agreement signed by the end of July with the state. So ultimately, the referendum will be June 19th, and then we will ultimately move pretty quickly with the state to get the paperwork signed and movement at that point.
July of this year?
Correct, yes. Because ultimately, they're holding $9 million in reserve for us, and if we don't use it, that money will be going to somebody else. We're actually competing for a 0% loan, and we came in second place on that one. So we got the consolation prize of 2% award. So we're happy with that. The other projects that we have listed here, we have notice of intents in with the state. So ultimately what that means is we put the state on notice that we have plans to come to them with these projects for the dollar amounts that we're requesting. And once we go through a referendum and those projects become approved, if they do, then we will go back to the state to continue the process on the approval process with the state level.
Any federal funding?
And the federal funding comes through from the feds to the state. So the state revolving loan program receives about $40 million a year from the federal government to the state of Delaware. The state of Delaware takes that $40 million, divides it into water, sewer, stormwater, and other projects, and then uses that $10 million to offer us the low subsidized loans or grants. So ultimately, that's why we're receiving such a low offering at 2% and 3%, because this program is subsidized through the federal government.
What about Chestnut Hill Road? Are they building low-income homes there near Holy Family?
Not, as far as we know, that project is dead. Yeah. So the next slide here is the. So the remaining 26.7 million, we have $3 million that are sitting out there, and they make up these projects that we have here listed. And ultimately, over the 5-year period, we need $3 million. And Timmy mentioned them earlier. I'm not going to go through all those again. All right. So this proposed referendum helps us allocate the financial obligation across the next 20 plus years to share the costs equitably and fairly. So our current debt service of $2.7 million would increase to about $3.5 million in 2022, and then drop as we get into the out years. So this chart really just shows the impact of this referendum on our current budget. It's not rolling into other projects that may happen over the next 20 years or so. So any debt service amount over the current $2.7 million that we have built into our budget, it would require us to find the revenue needed to fund the additional payment. The past couple of years, about 90 cents on every capital dollar spent came from cash from the city or current revenue. Our goal is to diversify this spending plan to a combination of cash and debt payments in order to get the projects we need to completed and to spread the cost of these projects out across their useful lives. So ultimately, what this chart is showing here, the green piece of this chart is what is our current debt structure, and we're right now at about $2.7 million a year in our part of our annual budget. So it's about a little over 3% of our revenue is funding debt service. My goal is the finance director here is to keep our debt obligation around that 3 to 4% range every year. So we have a structured methodology in how what we anticipate to use for projects in our capital plan. By doing so, it helps the Public Works Department and our other departments with these types of projects to plan out the out years as to when things are going to happen and why. And then my job is to find the funding and how we're going to handle all this. So right now, the city's using about 9 cents on the dollar towards debt. The county is for about 80 cents on every dollar in the capital plan that the county's debt is being used. And the state is pretty much 99 cents on every dollar for non-transportation projects is coming from the bond market. So we're very low, and I'm not proposing that we need to be that high, but we need to be somewhere in between, which will help us allocate these projects out over the lives of the people who will be using them. Ultimately, if we were not the...
Excuse me, Dave, on that slide.
Yeah.
The term of the borrowing is out to 20 years? Is that
Correct. So what it goes a little beyond 20 years. So what happens is our amortization schedules on our projects don't start at year one until the project is 100% complete. So when we have the ribbon cutting ceremony on Rodney, that's when we first start our first payment on our debt. Up to that point, we're just making interest-only payments to the state. So it helps us with our planning because this won't have a huge impact on our current budgetary needs, but it gives us enough time to plan that into our future budgetary requirements. So as you can see, I go back to this chart, we have our green bars, but then when we're stacking on the questions 1, 2, 3, and 4, you can see the impact that will have in the out years. But ultimately, my goal is to, let me try these steps out. So this is where we are right now. My goal is to keep us going across on a flat line. So our total debt that we pay every year, our debt payments are about 3 to 4% of our total revenue in that year. I believe I could still work a little magic on this to make this piece fit in there. I've got really good at Jenga, so I think I can fit that block down there to make it work for us.
All right, but what about the fact that we have these percentages of pipes and water mains, et cetera, failing? And so they're going to require debt service at some point.
Absolutely. Or a mixture of cash and debt. And that's the piece that we're going to be working on is, I'll get into, you're going to spoil the surprise if I keep talking some more. So let me move on a little bit. So, okay, so if we paid strictly cash for these nearly $27 million in projects between now and 2022, our cash requirements would substantially increase over the next 4 years, and then it would taper off as we get past 2023. The projects themselves get completed, but raising such a large amount of cash would be a challenge if these projects were to continue as they exist. So as you can see in the chart here, it's not an easy slope for us. So we have a huge need going from $3 million, 2.7 in the previous chart, or even at the bottom on the green here, and we're roaring up to almost $13 million in a very short period. So what that happens is I have to come up with $27 million in 3 years. So how do I do that? You can all think about amongst yourselves how that would happen. But ultimately, what I would be doing is charging everyone today for a Rodney project that has a 50-year useful life. So I would much rather go on a a low-interest loan of 2%, which is lower than inflation when you go out 20 years, and spread that cost out to the folks who are going to be using the Rodney project over that period. Otherwise, I'm knocking on everybody's door asking for some extra money today, which I truly see is not something that's fair to do. I'd much rather allocate that cost over the life of these projects. So as you can see, it's a much different chart going from using debt financing as a little of a steady slope to the rocky bump going over the Rocky Mountains here. This. So it's a good question. So what happens is if the referendum does not pass, ultimately Tom, myself, and Tim, and a few other folks back in the office will reconvene with council. We'll rework our capital plan. But these projects need to happen. They need to get done. And a lot of times these large projects don't make it into the budget merely because we can't afford to do them in any given year at one shot. So they get put on the shelf. The city has done a very good job with maintaining to the best that we can at this point, but we're starting to see the light coming at us, which is usually just a locomotive, not really the light at the end of the tunnel. And staying ahead of these projects is the best thing for us to do on a financial perspective and also for a community perspective, because we don't want folks having disruption in their services. So let's get down to the nitty-gritty here. This is the part I think you've all waited 3 hours for. So assuming nothing else changed in regards to our fees, what would our estimated tax and utility rates look like if we continued with these projects? So the top box, the city represents the city paying cash for everything mentioned. Due to the cash requirements each year, rates would fluctuate greatly until the projects were completed. Large increases would be followed by large reductions in subsequent years. The net overall impact would be a 12.7% increase for the average city resident in 2019 when you roll in water, sewer, stormwater, electric, and property taxes. Moving down to the bottom box, with the use of debt financing, the city is able to show modest increases in rates if they are necessary to cover the cost of the estimated debt service payments. In the debt scenario, stormwater increases the greatest in 2019, which is equal to $1 per month for the residential homeowner. All the other rates see increases between 1 and 2.6% in years 19 through 22. So what we'll be looking at is a 12.7% increase, and these are numbers based on estimates that we have using cash piece, and then another 2% in 20, and then you would see reductions in 21 and 22, all related specifically to these projects, nothing else the city has going on. Moving down to debt, using the state revolving loan program and bond financing, you can see that they're a little more less objectionable inflationary numbers, and honestly, those numbers increase less than what inflation has been over the past couple of years. So you would see a 1% increase, a 0.4%, a 0.5%, and a 0.8% going out. So it's a little more easier for us to work with those numbers.
Although, just to clarify, Dave,
Yep.
those are increases just due to debt financing. There could be additional increases
Correct.
due to increases in
Yes.
service.
Correct. All right, so translating those into dollars, what are we looking at? So on average, the average city resident spends about $276 per month here using all of our utilities and taxes and stormwater. Using cash, with the cash plan, you would see a $35 a month increase next year, followed by a $6 increase the next year, and then reductions in 21 and 22 of $23 and $18. So it's kind of difficult for me as the finance manager here to come to council asking for these types of budgets in the out years. I don't think I might not make it to 19 if that happens. So I think the career enhancing model would be the one at the bottom. So not saying what to vote for, but ultimately what this gets us down to, though, is the fairness amongst the residents. This is allocating the cost of these projects over their lives, which then has incremental and smaller increases to the current residences and businesses who are using the resources today. So we're taking a portion of Rodney and a portion of all the water and sewer projects and charging them out over the loan period versus trying to come up with all the cash over a three-year period. So if you move to the bottom, you can see the debt financing, the $276 per month goes to $279, which is less than $3 a month. And $1 of that is the Rodney project itself. Then you're going up another $1.20, $1.46, and then $2.33. So those numbers are a little more manageable, and also it helps me find other revenue sources that doesn't have to be through rate increases and such. If we're having debt financing, I can maybe be able to find a couple $100,000 that would pay for that debt number versus passing that along into the rates using debt versus using the cash piece.
How does Newark compare with Delaware and Wilmington using debt repayment over cash?
We are by far the lowest, extremely low. The city of Wilmington, Newcastle County, the state of Delaware, all heavily used the bond market as ways to finance their capital projects. And as I was saying earlier, the state of Delaware uses 100% of the bond market. They borrow up to their limit that they could possibly borrow and use that to fund their capital program. So, and one great thing getting into the state revolving loans is the money we would get back from being a member of the state revolving loan program. It's like Costco. You get benefits back from when you buy things. So by paying interest on these loans at 2% and 3%, that money goes back into a pot at the state, and then the state takes that money, turns it around and turns it into grants and other low interest loans. So we can inevitably fund future projects that the city needs through the same program using our own money that we were paying interest on. So if they were a public bank, they wouldn't be in business anymore. I'm convinced of that. So, but it's great for us, and because it's competitively based, if we don't apply for it and we don't accept these programs, someone else in the state of Delaware will. So I would much rather city residents and city businesses take advantage of these programs than us to go to the bond market or go to a loan and not be eligible for these types of programs, which would be advanced planning grants, incentive programs for asset management, which as Tom alluded to earlier. By knowing what your system is, what your inventory is, and what it consists of, you're able to tell when your stuff's going to break. And the state has program money they give us to help us determine what that is. So things that we were going to do anyway, but now we have assistance from the state because we're card-carrying members of the SRL program. Moving down to they have matching grants from the wastewater facilities. A lot of them are 50% cash matches. So if we put up 50, they put up 50. So these are things that we wouldn't have the ability to have access to not being a part of this program. So any interest that we're paying on our current projects, we'll be getting a majority of that interest money back through these grants. And the best piece that I like, and moving on, I won't continue on with all the grants, there's a lot of them, is the low income additional financial assistance programs. So what happens here is we'd be eligible for an annual grant of $200,000 for water and $200,000 for sewer, up to $200 per account, so $400 total per household for income eligible people who have issues with water and making their water and sewer payments. So as we get into looking at our rate structures, and Tom alluded to earlier about how when people are gone for a month and you get a zero bill for zero use, we still have expenses. As we're reworking our utility model, we can use programs like this to help the impact on the low-income residents in the city. So something near and dear to our hearts to make sure that those who have difficulties paying their bills have access to the proper means to make sure that they're getting their obligations covered. And it's even better that it's not city money that's happening with.
Are you going to discuss what the ballot will look like when we...
Absolutely. I'm bringing Tom in as the closer to handle all that. 30 more to go.
I know UD doesn't pay property tax.
Yes.
Do they pay utilities?
Yes, they pay a lot of utilities. So UD's electric use and electric bill is almost equivalent to the electric bill for all the residential properties in the whole city. So they pay a lot, and same with water and stormwater. So one of the things that we like the most about the Rodney project is that we're buying it from UD and we're paying for it with money from the stormwater utility. Well, 35 cents out of every dollar that we get from the stormwater utility is from the University of Delaware property. So they're actually buying back 1/3 of their own project. So they pay a lot of our utility funds come from them. They're by far our largest customer.
If I could add, UD has over 200 accounts, utility accounts, and just their top 26 is about 1/3 of our total electric purchases for the city. So they're a huge piece.
Yeah. So what's the process from here? In Newark, as I mentioned earlier, the referendum process is spelled out in our charter. So we made this timeline to try and simplify it. We've moved through most of the process. We're in the public advertising window where we're telling people about the referendum, telling them to come out and vote, and explaining the projects and information associated with the vote actually on June 19th. Your election polling place will be the same as a regular election, but with the referendum, who's eligible to vote is a little different. So if you're eligible to vote in a regular election, you're eligible to vote in this election. But there are some extra categories that aren't normally allowed to vote. So if you're a non-resident property owner, you are allowed to vote. And if you are a corporation, LLC, or a corporation that owns property, you're allowed one vote per corporation that owns property. So if you have 5 corporations, different LLCs that own 5 properties, you can get 5 votes. So it is a little different than a traditional election. So assuming June 19th goes well, June 21st, the results are certified by the election board, and then it could be a little sooner, but realistically July 9th, council would certify the election results at that time. If the referendum fails, process ends there, and then we kind of start our own process of trying to figure out how we're going to do these projects without debt. So in summary, your question, the ballot, I actually have a slide with the ballot. I'm not sure if you were here when we put it up earlier. I can put it up again. But it's 4 questions. Question 1 is the Rodney Stormwater Facility by itself, the pond, very minimal park amenities, just a trail basically. Question 2 is everything else associated with the Rodney facility, so all the nicer parks features, the outdoor classrooms, educational aspects, fishing pier, that sort of thing. Question 3 is the water and sewer projects and everything that would be through the state revolving loan fund. And then question 4 are our general fund projects, so paving type projects, repairs at City Hall, changes to our maintenance facility, and that sort of thing.
This will to approve projects, not to finance it.
Right, technically you are voting to authorize us to borrow for the projects. The projects themselves,
That question.
so that is these questions. So this question 1, you're authorizing us to borrow up to $6.5 million for this purpose. Question 2 is $2.5 million for this purpose. But then each one of these individual projects that we discussed will come to council on its own, and council will review the cost after it's been bid, the actual cost, contractor, the specifics of the project, and then they'll vote up or down whether to move forward with the project and actually borrow the money. So it's a little different. And it's different than a usual school referendum in that, and this way, we're a vote yes for the referendum actually saves you money instead of voting yes and it costs you money. So it is a little weird in that regard. So we're putting all this information up on the city's website at this address, newarkde.gov /vote. And then we created an email address, asknewark@newark.de.us. You can email us with literally any question about anything city related. We set it up for the referendum, but we'll be keeping that email address up in the future. Yes, ma'am.
I'm probably unusual, but I have neither one of those facilities, so how would I get it?
So you can also call us at 366-7000. That's the city's phone number, and Dave's got a card there for you.
Yep. And
we will be happy to answer your questions. If you do have internet access, we'll be developing a frequently asked questions. We actually have, it's up on the website already. And any questions that don't come up tonight are
I
likely.
do have a question. You mentioned, okay, what, $50 million, okay, for electric upgrade. It's amazing, we got a corporation, very profitable, providing us electric. Why is the city of Newark replacing electric upgrade facilities? That doesn't make any sense.
So the electric company in Newark is us. So we have the trucks, the lines are ours, we maintain everything, and we buy power through Delaware Municipal Electric Corporation, which is also partially owned by us, from the electric markets. So it's in our interest.
So we have responsibility for all the electric facility and everything within this.
Correct.
Yes.
Yep.
Thank you.
Could you go back to the ballot that you brought
Yes.
early?
A lot of
Okay.
slides. There you go. So this is the actual ballot, ma'am. So there'll be 4 questions. Question 1, question 2, question 3, question 4. Each one stands on its own, and it's specific to the one. This question does build off the prior question, though. So if question 2 goes and question 1 doesn't, we're in a pickle. So we do have, so in our contract with the university, we confirmed this today, we do have an option if the referendum fails for the purchase of the land. In the contract, we did write in where we can buy it over time. It'd be at 3% interest. Technically, it's not borrowing, so it's kind of a loophole. 3% interest, $350,000 a year. We could purchase it over 6 years. It's a higher interest rate than we're paying through the state revolving loan fund, 50% higher. And it wouldn't do anything to address the actual buildings or building the pond or anything like that. It's literally just getting the property. The other downside of that is the way our contract is written, our purchase price for the property is $2.1 million, and we can deduct up to $700,000 of the demolition costs for the buildings that are there. So if we just buy the property and don't demo the buildings, it costs us $700,000 more than it does if we do both at the same time. So it really makes sense to do it all at one time. We save a lot of money, we get a better interest rate. And then I know we'll jump to the questions because I think we're basically there anyway. One question that we get a lot is what happens if the referendum fails and we don't buy the property? Well, the underlying zoning for that, once it transfers away from university ownership, so the university is exempt from zoning. So if they maintained ownership, they could build whatever they want there. If they sell it, it reverts back to a base zoning. The base zoning is RM, that's garden apartments, at 16 units per acre. So you'd be looking at potentially up to around 110 apartments at that location. So one thing I wanted to point out here with these 2 slides. So your question earlier was spot on about, there's all these other projects that are still in the pipeline that have to be addressed. What happens with them? So, this is the end of the 5-year window realistically. So we in year 6 is when we're finally paying full debt and interest, principal and interest payments on our loans. So realistically, that's also the end of our 5-year capital plan. So we have projects planned out here, but we don't have projects planned out here. We've got a pretty good idea what's going to be in there. There's going to be a lot of water mains, a lot of sewer type stuff, sewer pipe repair, but we don't know exactly how much. So over this period, we're going to be continuing to develop our asset management program. So, we have these nice digital maps now. In 2014, when I took over as Public Works Director, all of our maps were literally hand-drawn on pieces of paper across the wall. And you go over, you test a valve, it's like, all right, 23 turns, and you go over, you write it on the board. And that's how everything was kept. That was our records. So in the last 4 years, we've gotten to where we've got really good information on a lot of our stuff. So we're going to spend the next 5 years continuing to flesh that out, trying to get more information on our pipes so we can fine-tune how much pipe is actually going to be failing over the next few years and get away from just using the 70-year value. So our hope is that we can spread that peak out, kind of flatten it out some. And then, between here and here, a lot of buildings on the Star campus are going to come online. All those students will likely be here through university's plans. So we'll have additional revenues and we'll be able to address some of our rate structure issues. And hopefully, as we move through the process, we'll be able to forecast better into the future. But realistically, what's going to happen is we're going to have to layer on some amount of additional debt 5 years out. And then once you hit 10 years out, we'll probably layer on some other additional amount of debt. And realistically, in the future, we've used all cash for a long time, except for a handful of projects, really. I think that paradigm's got to shift to where we're using some mix. I would like to get away from, as best we can, using debt to pay for something that we're doing every single year, and use it more to handle the peaks that come through. Because if we're spending $1 million a year on water mains, it'd be great. We know we're going to spend that. Let's just get that into our base cash flow, and then use the debt service to absorb those projects that come through every 5 or 10 years, like a treatment plant upgrade or a large repair, to knock the peaks off. Take that off and put it down in the valley using debt. Now, if we don't use debt, we go to this slide. The problem doesn't end here. We basically just put in the next 5 years of projects, and it does this for the next 5 years, and then we get 5 more years out, it does that for the next 5 years. So The slides can be, you work with the data you have, but it doesn't tell necessarily the full story, like that. But, yes, ma'am.
Somebody said, maybe you did, apartments on the Rodney property. Was that flood area?
So, her question was, would they be building in the flooding area? So they would have to design it to get the water through the site. So the issue with Rodney is a lot of the flooding isn't occurring from, well, some of it is, but most of the flooding is coming from the upstream area. By law, all they're required to do is they can't impede that, they can't block it and flood somebody upstream from them. They just have to get it through their site. So maybe they're putting in bigger pipes or something to get it through. But they don't have to do anything with it. All they have to do is manage their property itself. So when they do their development, they just can't make it worse, but they're not obligated to make it any better. So realistically, they probably wouldn't do a whole lot to fix the problem. Yes, sir.
If all these referendums are approved, has anyone stopped to think what would the average taxpayer see as an increase in his taxes?
Yes. So if the referendum passes, your monthly impact will be, and everything goes as planned. We build things as we currently plan. Your increase next year will be $2.70 a month on average. $2.70 per month on average. If the referendum doesn't pass and we still complete the projects on the same schedule,
3 projects now.
Yeah,
excuse me?
All 3 projects.
that's everything.
Yeah, so if the referendum doesn't pass and we still keep everything on that same schedule, instead of $2.70 a month, next year you're talking about $35 a month. So it's a huge, huge difference doing them the two ways. Now, realistically, I don't think this would happen because I don't think our council, realistically, I don't think we could expect them to push through rate increases like this. Because, an important thing to point out, and I know it was mentioned earlier, is this impact is just these projects. So the projects that are before you are not the entire capital plan, and they don't reflect, these increases don't reflect anything in the operating budget. So, we still have contractual obligations through our labor contracts, healthcare costs, inflationary pressures that are going to be pushing on our budget in addition to this. So this is just these capital projects. So we still have to keep our cost control on our operating expenses, and there is going to be some increase on the operating side as a result of inflation.
Yeah, and ultimately, we're trying to get ahead of the other municipalities in the state of Delaware to compete with the state revolving loan bucket of money. Because ultimately, as other municipalities are coming across the same issues we're having and we're facing, they're up against their debt service limits to borrow, and they can't borrow anymore. So they're restricted now to just going to the state for assistance through these types of programs. So us staying in front of them gives us a better odds and better chances of receiving this money versus it going somewhere else. So that's our biggest fear right now.
The flooding that this project will address is, there's a couple of main areas. So primarily, we get flooding right at the underpass that makes us close South Main Street. Since 2011, we've closed it 3 times at the underpass where no traffic. We've had to close the road, pretty major road. None of those were hurricanes. Those were just thunderstorms that caused enough flooding to close the road. In addition to that, downstream in Devon, the Bins area, and some areas of Old Newark, there are whole streets that go underwater. So we had a resident come in and told us that the water was up to the side view mirror on his truck. The next day he brought a picture showing the water up to the side view mirror on his truck. So it's pretty remarkable how much of Devon and the Bins go underwater from storms that are not hurricanes, just relatively intense thunderstorms. But there were 3 in 2013 alone that caused large areas of Devon and Bins to go underwater. So the issue that we have is we can't just put a bigger pipes in and take it down to the creek, because basically the water runs from Rodney and Dickinson through Old Newark, then water comes in from Devon and the Bins onto the side. It goes through the Star campus and into the Silverbrook neighborhood, and the Silverbrook neighborhood floods. Silverbrook itself floods. So if we put big pipes in here, we're basically just going to move the flooding from Devon and the Bins and South Main Street, and we're going to put it down in Silverbrook and flood them out worse. So the only way that we can really start to address the problems is by taking water from the streets and putting it somewhere safe. So we're going to move it from Devon to bins. We're basically we're going to hold water back at the top of the watershed. And think of it like a highway. You've got a busy highway, and that's the pipe. And there's so many cars on the highway, so much water in that pipe that water can't get in from Devon to the bins. You're just sitting at the light. You can't get out on the highway. So by holding those cars back, holding that water back, it'll free up space in those pipes, and water can flow out of those neighborhoods that are flooding pretty badly now. And then over the next 24 to 48 hours, it'll flow out of that large pond. So we did some kind of back of the napkin type analysis of what it would cost to get the same value through other land purchases. So like putting those basins underneath the roadway is super expensive. Developers do that because it frees up land that they can use for something else versus doing a pond. Ponds are way less expensive than that. But buying property and trying to assemble enough property, it would have to be in the watershed, so it would need to be in Devon, in the bins. We'd be talking about buying 25, 30 homes that would all need to be in the same general area, demolishing them, building a pond right downtown. It would be an astronomical expense. And unless we wanted to do eminent domain, which I can tell you none of us want to do, it would take us 20, 30 years to assemble those homes because we'd have to wait for people to turn over. So this is really, in our opinion, the only really viable solution to try and address those areas like down in the bins that have the kind of damaging flooding.
So the piping on Main Street, I understand it goes down really small, and that's why it gets.
Yes.
That Main Street will end up, I assume, getting torn up a bit. So are we holding off on the Delaware project on Main Street until after this all gets done?
So we're around on South Main. So the Delaware project is East Main and West Main to Deer Park. So it's basically Deer Park to McDonald's on the Library Avenue. So they're not going around to this side. So the flooding that we're having on actual Main Street is a totally different issue than the Rodney problem. So on Main Street, we've got big pipes going into small pipes. So when we have a heavy storm, it comes up onto the road and floods the road. So as part of the Delaware project, they're going to be going through, I actually got final plans today. I haven't had a chance to look at them. They're going to be improving the drainage structures on Main Street and addressing that bottleneck that we have that's causing some of the flooding. Is it going to fix everything? Probably not, but it should make it a lot better than it was.
Don't they usually pave it and then dig it up and put the piping under it?
So ironically enough, they are paving it yesterday and today, but they're just doing temporary patching because anyone that's driven down Main Street knows how bad it is. And the real project begins this fall, and it's going to take 1.5 years. So they knew that they couldn't make people continue driving over that road for the next 1.5 years in that condition. So they did patching just of the lanes the last 2 days and tomorrow. And then the current plan is October. We'll see if they start in October. It seems pretty late in the fall to start, but
What's going on Main Street right now?
that's the temporary patching that they're doing now. So they're doing patching of just the travel lanes. And then in the fall and through the next 18 months, they're going to be improving the ADA access, Americans with Disabilities access, so handicap accessibility all down Main Street, improving, repaving the road, replacing curbs, improving drainage structures, pipes, catch basins, things like that.
I come from New England, and a lot of the small towns up there, because there's a lot of hurricanes and bad storms, as they replace sewer, they're burying the electric lines at the same time. Phones and telephone lines all right along with the sewer, with the pipes down there.
Yeah.
Eliminating trees, eliminating telephone poles, falling down and cutting out electric service, which we are around here.
So, I would tell you that everybody at City Hall would love to do that, but the last price, the last price we got was $17 million just to bury the power lines on Main Street, and that was about a decade ago. So it's I love the idea. I think it would make Main Street look a lot nicer. It would improve our reliability, but it's just a lot of money, and we've got other things that are.
I've lost my service twice in the last year, and when I called up, a car hit a telephone pole. That's why your service is out.
Squirrels take out the power probably more than anything else in this town. It's ridiculous. You'd never believe it. But does anyone else have any other questions? If you don't feel comfortable asking a question in the larger setting, we'll be here for a little while to answer your questions one-on-one. I'll hand it off to Jerry.
If I could just add one thing, the foregone tax revenue will be about $50,000 a year on the Rodney project. $50,000 a year roughly would be about the equivalent tax revenue generated from that parcel.
Like an $8 million.
Yeah, about $8 million assessment. Yeah.
I want to thank everyone for coming out tonight. I especially want to thank Tom and his staff So last year, Tom agreed to take on the position of city manager. The bad news is he doesn't realize the council voted not to consider any applicants. You know, they all have been out multiple times a week, every week in sessions just like this, trying to get the word out as to what we're seeing in city government.
We're raised here, right?
Yeah, that'll be good. But, you know, I do want to thank them. And the other thing I want to mention, because it's something that's maybe near and dear to a lot of our hearts in this area. Real quick, you know, there is a proposal to redo College Square. I met with the developer today. We toured a couple of their properties up in Pennsylvania. They have agreed that it won't be till the fall of the year. We'll have a meeting like this, an information session, so everyone can see what the plan is for College Square. And I would encourage everyone to get out and see this plan. I really would. Again, Rob?
I just want to follow up on the location of the vote.
Yes.
Because we have voted, I live in Whitechapel Village, and we voted at the school out, I don't remember the name of the school. Out,
Well,
Jenny.
the Jenny Smith School is for state elections.
Okay.
And since we handle all our elections, whether it's council, mayor elections, or referendums, we pick locations within the city. And this vote will be from 7 a.m. to 8 p.m. at the Etna Firehouse. So, you know, it's right up the street, you know, nobody can say that, gee, it's too far, and, you know, you're using a lot of gas or something like that, you know, so.
I would include that in your advertisements or whatever, because that is not normal for us.
And where is this session going to be tomorrow? It's going to be on the city website and,
It's basically the city's YouTube page, it'll be linked on our website.
okay, it'll be on YouTube. So if anybody didn't make it, I strongly encourage them to jump on there and spend a little time and see the information that's presented. But again, thank you to everyone for coming out tonight, and I'll see everybody at Etna on the 19th.
Thank you.